The words struck her with the force of a physical blow, sharp and cold in the stuffy air of the dress shop. Too small. I can't be seen in the church with that. The merchant, a man named Sterling, whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance, didn't even have the decency to look at her as he spoke. He was dismissing her. Eliza Vance, a woman who had crossed half a country with needle-calloused fingers and a spine of tempered steel, as if she were a flawed piece of merchandise. The whispers of the townswomen coiled around her like snakes. Humiliation, hot and bitter, threatened to choke her. But as she stood there engulfed in lace that felt like a shroud, a pair of eyes met hers from across the room. They belonged to a man leaning against the doorframe, dust on his boots and silence in his gaze. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't pitying her. He was just watching. And in that moment, in the wreckage of her dreams, an entirely different and far more dangerous spark was lit. A fire no one, not even she, knew existed. Part 1. The Weight of Whispers. The town of Redemption, Montana, was built on judgment. It rose from the dust on promises of salvation and second chances, but its true currency was reputation, traded in whispers over fence posts and damning glances in the general store. For Eliza Vance, arriving at 29 with savings stitched into the hem of her only good dress, it was meant to be the start of a solid life, a partnership built on grit and mutual respect. She wasn't a blushing, desperate girl. She was a seamstress, an artisan of fabric and thread who believed in creating things that lasted. The mail-order arrangement with Mr. Sterling was a practical matter, a joining of his mercantile ambition with her desire for a home to anchor her restless heart. The humiliation began in Mrs. Albright's dress shop. The wedding gown, paid for with years of painstaking labor, was a confection of ivory lace and hope. But the moment Eliza stepped from the fitting room, the atmosphere curdled. The dress, altered twice, still pooled slightly at her feet, an offense to the town's rigid sensibilities. Sterling's lip curled in disdain. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulder and narrow in the soul, and he surveyed her as if inspecting livestock. His pronouncement, "too small," was not a quiet regret but a public decree. He left her standing there, a statue of mortified pride. The silence he left behind was quickly filled by the snickering of the other patrons. Like a child playing dress-up, one woman hissed to her friend, loud enough for the whole store to hear. Eliza's chin stayed high, her back ramrod straight, but inside, something fractured. She changed back into her practical brown dress with methodical slowness, her movements precise and contained, a dam against the flood of shame. She folded the wedding gown perfectly, a final act of professional dignity, and handed it to Mrs. Albright without meeting the older woman's pitying gaze. The walk back to her boarding house was an ordeal. Every window seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. The whispers followed her, biting at her heels. Girls half her age, with futures as wide open as the plains, giggled behind their hands. Even the preacher, who normally made a point of greeting every soul, suddenly found the dust on his boots intensely interesting as she passed. Redemption had passed its judgment. She was found wanting. Back in the suffocating quiet of her rented room, the dream of a life in the West crumbled to dust. Her suitcase lay open on the bed, a gaping mouth waiting to swallow her hopes and carry them back to the cramped, familiar misery of her sister's Baltimore tenement. At least there, the walls didn't whisper. Her hands moved automatically, folding her few belongings. Each garment was a memory of a failed gamble. The West was a land of big skies, big mountains, and big men. There was no room, it seemed, for a woman of small stature, no matter how vast her spirit. It was nearly dusk when the knock came. Firm, but not loud. A single, solid rap on the wood. She expected the boarding house owner with a message of eviction, or perhaps a final, pitying platitude. Instead, when she opened the door, he was there. The man from the dress shop. He stood on the porch, his hat held respectfully in his hands. He was taller than she'd realized, with shoulders that spoke of hard labor, not tailored coats. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing sun-browned arms etched with veins that stood out like rivers on a map. Dust from the trail clung to his boots, a testament to a life lived outside the town's stifling confines. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind, and his eyes, a startling clear gray, held a quiet intensity that seemed to see right through the armor she had so carefully constructed. He didn't offer a name. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "I was in the store," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I saw what happened. You didn't flinch. You didn't cry. You just stood. That takes a different kind of tall." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. He wasn't offering pity. He was offering recognition. He had looked past the merchant's insult, past the town's mockery, and had seen the core of her, the unyielding strength she held in her 5'1" frame. A jolt went through her, a current of heat that had nothing to do with shame, and everything to do with a wild, unfamiliar feeling. It was the shock of being truly seen. He gave a curt nod, as if his piece was said, and turned to leave. He walked down the porch steps with a quiet dignity, his boots making soft sounds on the wood, and disappeared into the deepening twilight. Eliza stood frozen in the doorway, the cool evening air washing over her. The half-packed suitcase on her bed suddenly seemed like a relic from another woman's life. A woman who ran. Slowly, she closed the door. She walked to the bed, not to finish packing, but to unpack. She lifted her clothes out, one by one, and put them back in the chest of drawers. She wasn't staying for a wedding, or for a man. She was staying because a stranger, a silent man with dust on his boots, had looked at her and seen a giant. And in the desolate landscape of her heart, that recognition was a seed. She had a sudden, fierce craving to see what, in this harsh and unforgiving land, it might grow into. The air in the room no longer felt suffocating. It felt charged with a dangerous, thrilling possibility. Part 2. The carved word in the burning path. For 2 days, the silence of the town was a heavy blanket. The whispers had faded, replaced by a watchful quiet. Eliza kept to her room, mending her own clothes with a ferocity she usually reserved for paying customers. She expected to hear his name, the silent ranchers, mentioned at the communal breakfast table or in the snippets of gossip she overheard. But there was nothing. It was as if he had been a mirage, a trick of the fading light. The doubt began to creep back in. Had she imagined the respect in his eyes? Had she conjured his words out of her own desperate need? Then, on the third morning, she found it. Hanging from the simple gate of the boarding house by a piece of twine was a small, crudely cut square of pine wood. It was warm from the morning sun. Her name, Eliza, was carved into the surface, the letters deep and certain. Below it, 4 more words: "You are not small." Her breath hitched. She snatched the piece of wood, her fingers tracing the rough edges where the knife had slipped. This was real. This was tangible proof. It wasn't a poetic compliment whispered in the twilight. It was a statement of fact, carved into the very substance of the West. It was a shield. A brand. Her heart, which had been a cold, tight knot in her chest, began to beat with a fierce, wild rhythm. This was no gentle courtship. This was a raw, unspoken declaration. It didn't ask for anything. It simply was. A fire lit in her belly. Tucking the wooden square into her apron pocket, she felt its weight against her hip, a constant, grounding presence. The suitcase by her bed now felt like a cage she had almost willingly stepped into. No more. She set off for the general store, not with a clear plan, but with a burning need to push back against the world that had tried to erase her. The town felt different today, or perhaps she was different. The women who had snickered now offered hesitant nods, their eyes skittering away from her direct gaze. They knew they had misjudged, had missed the quiet strength the silent rancher had so easily identified. Their cruelty seemed cheap and loud in the face of his stark, carved words. She didn't find him at the store, but as she turned to leave, Mr. Abernathy, the proprietor, a man with kind eyes, and a weary slump to his shoulders, leaned over the counter. "That rancher," he said, his voice low. "His name's Silas Blackwood. He keeps to himself up in the hills. Doesn't say much, but when he does, it tends to be the gospel truth. Silas Blackwood. The name felt like it was forged from rock and shadow. It settled in her mind. A name to match the quiet intensity of his gaze. That evening, Eliza found herself drawn to the edge of town, looking west toward the rolling hills that bled into the horizon. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. Somewhere out there was his homestead. Somewhere out there was a man who saw the world not for what it appeared to be, but for what it was. She clutched a wooden square in her pocket, the sharp corners digging into her palm. A new feeling swelled inside her, fierce and untamed. It wasn't just dignity. It was a primal, possessive urge, a desire to claim the respect he had offered, to meet his silent strength with her own burning fire. The next morning, she found the map. It was tucked beneath her door, drawn on a piece of scrap leather. The lines were rough, marking a creek bed, a stand of cottonwoods, a distinctive rock formation. An arrow pointed west, toward the hills. There was no signature, only two initials burned into the corner. SB. It was a path, an invitation, and a profound risk. This went beyond propriety, beyond the rigid rules of society that had so callously cast her aside. This was something wilder. But the memory of his steady gray eyes, devoid of pity, filled her with a reckless courage. She had come west seeking a solid foundation, and all she had found was judgment. Silas Blackwood wasn't offering a foundation. He was offering a trail into the unknown. She packed a small satchel, a change of clothes, her sewing kit, the last of her bread, and the carved wooden square. She left her room without a backward glance, her sensible city boots crunching on the dusty main street. Each step away from the town felt like shedding a skin, unlearning the shame that had been branded on her. The sun beat down, and the trail was unforgiving. Her boots, not made for such terrain, soon rubbed her heels raw until they bled. But the sharp physical pain was a welcome distraction from the memory of humiliation. It was a pain she could control, a pain that was a consequence of her own choice. The land grew wilder, the silence broken only by the cry of a hawk and the rasp of her own breathing. This was Silas Blackwood's world, a world of rock and sun and raw, untamed beauty. It was a world that didn't care about a woman's height. And as she crested a ridge, her body aching and her spirit soaring, she saw it. Tucked into a fold of the hills, sheltered by ancient pines, was a small, rugged ranch house. A curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a lonely flag in the vast wilderness. This was it. The end of the path. The beginning of everything. Part 3. The threshold of a wilder world. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The ranch was a testament to solitary resilience. A sagging but functional gate, a small barn with a door missing, and the main cabin, built of sturdy logs chinked with mud, looking as much a part of the landscape as the rocks around it. It was stark and unadorned, yet every line of it spoke of one man's uncomplaining labor. There was an honesty to it, a raw integrity that the painted facades of redemption sorely lacked. This was his world. Wild, untamed, silent. Before she could lose her nerve, before the ingrained propriety of her past could drag her back down the trail, the cabin door creaked open. Silas Blackwood stepped out onto the porch. He held a tin coffee cup in one hand, and his face was a mask of stunned disbelief. He froze, his gray eyes widening as they fixed on her. He looked at her as if she were a ghost, a story he thought had already ended. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions. He was the first to break it, his voice rough as if unused to conversation. "I didn't think you'd come." The blisters on her heels screamed. Her throat was tight with dust and emotion, but she met his gaze without wavering. A wild, reckless energy coursed through her. "I didn't think you'd leave a map." A flicker of something, a reluctant smile perhaps, touched his lips. "Didn't want to speak for you. Just wanted to leave a path." The simplicity of his words resonated deep within her. He hadn't summoned her, hadn't demanded her presence. He had simply cleared a way, should she choose to walk it. And that respect for her agency was more intoxicating than any flowery compliment. "Then I'll walk it," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. She took a step forward, then another, the satchel swinging at her side, the pain in her feet forgotten. "Not because I'm lost, but because I'm choosing where to go next." He nodded slowly, a profound understanding passing between them. He stepped aside, holding the door open. He wasn't inviting her in so much as acknowledging her right to be there. For the first time since arriving in Montana, Eliza wasn't asking for permission. She was crossing a threshold of her own volition. The inside of the cabin was as stark as the outside. It was one room, dominated by a stone fireplace. A rough-hewn table with a single chair stood in the center. A bed was built into the far wall. It was impeccably clean, but achingly empty. This was the fortress of a man who had long been alone. And yet, he had seen her loneliness and reached across the void. He didn't bombard her with questions. He simply took a second cup from a hook, poured her water from a well bucket, and gestured to the bench on the porch. He sat beside her, not too close but not distant either. They sat in a shared silence that was more comfortable than any conversation she had ever had. She sipped the cool water, her eyes taking in everything: the worn leather of a saddle in need of mending, the neat stack of firewood, the utter absence of any feminine touch. This man, she realized with a jolt, was as much an outcast as she was, albeit by choice. He lived in a silence of his own making, yet he had heard her silent scream in that crowded dress shop. "You live alone?" she finally asked, her voice soft. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "Since my mother passed. Before that, I just worked. Never had much use for towns." "Then why were you there that day?" The question burned in her. He shrugged, a simple movement of his broad shoulders. "Horse through a shoe, needed nails, heard the talk, saw the laughter." He paused, turning his intense gray eyes on her. "Then I saw you. You didn't break. Most people, they bend, or they break." A lump formed in her throat. No one had ever described her that way. Small, delicate, quiet, yes, but not unbreakable. The heat that had sparked in the boarding house room now coiled low in her belly, a slow-burning fire. This man didn't just see her strength. He seemed to value it above all else. His quiet admiration was a potent aphrodisiac, more powerful than any cheap flattery. It made her feel a desire so fierce it was almost painful, a yearning to be as strong and untamed as he perceived her to be. He stood abruptly, as if uncomfortable with the intensity of the moment. "There's an old chair in the barn. Frame's cracked. I keep meaning to fix it." He looked at her, a challenge in his eyes. "Thought maybe you could show me how." It was a clumsy offering, but she understood its true meaning perfectly. He was asking her to stay. He was asking her to share her skills, to be a partner, not a dependent. He was offering her a place not just in his home, but in his work. "I can do more than hem dresses, Mr. Blackwood," she said, a small, challenging smile on her lips. "I figured," he replied, and the ghost of his own smile returned. She followed him to the barn. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and leather. Golden shafts of light pierced the gloom through the slats in the walls, illuminating dancing dust motes. The chair was there, a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, its back leg split. As they knelt together over the broken frame, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was charged, electric. It was filled with the potent chemistry of two solitary souls recognizing a kindred spirit. It was the silence of choosing, of beginning, of something wild and powerful slowly, quietly taking root. Part 4. The storm within and without. That night, Eliza stayed. Not because Silas asked, but because leaving felt like a betrayal of the wild instinct that had led her there. The rhythm of the ranch, the quiet labor, the steady presence of the mountains, the vast star-dusted sky, was beginning to match the rhythm of her own heart. Their dinner was a lesson in silent communication. He pulled a second plate from a mismatched stack, set 2 tin cups on the table worn smooth by his solitary meals. A pot of beans and bacon simmered on the stove, and a half loaf of dark, heavy bread sat under a cloth. Without a word, Eliza rolled up her sleeves, took the knife, and began slicing the bread with a practiced hand. He didn't stop her. He simply passed her the salt. A silent acknowledgement of her place at his table. As they ate, she studied him. His hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of a man who wrestled a living from the earth. But his movements were deliberate, economical. He carried his strength not as a weapon, but as a tool he had long since mastered. His quietness wasn't a lack of things to say, it was a choice. He didn't perform his masculinity, he simply inhabited it. And a raw, primal attraction, unlike anything she had ever known, washed over her. It was a desire not just for the man, but for the world he represented. A world of substance, of silence, of untamable strength. "Why the carving?" she asked, her voice a low murmur in the quiet cabin. "Why not just speak to me?" He chewed thoughtfully, his gray eyes considering her. "Words are cheap," he said finally. "People in town use them to build cages. For themselves, for others. I wanted to give you something solid. Something you could hold. Proof. Proof that she wasn't invisible." That one word struck her with the force of a physical blow. It was the word that had defined her entire life. Too short to be noticed, too quiet to be heard. But this man, this silent man from the hills, had seen her. And in his seeing her, she was beginning to see herself differently. Not as small, but as concentrated. Not as quiet, but as deliberate. After dinner, they didn't touch. They sat on the porch as the stars blazed to life in the ink-black sky. The distant cry of a coyote was a lonely, beautiful sound. It wasn't a threat. It was a reminder that she was in a world governed by older, truer laws. Before they turned in for the night, he to his bed, she to a pallet had made for her by the fire. He spoke one last time. "This world out here," he said, gesturing to the vast, dark wilderness, "it doesn't measure you by inches. It measures you by what you can withstand." He looked at her, and the fire in his gaze was unmistakable. "Your heart isn't small, Eliza Vance. It's the biggest thing in this valley." She didn't sleep much that night. The fire in the hearth warmed her skin, but a different, more intense fire burned within her. Every nerve ending was alive, humming with the potent awareness of him sleeping just a few feet away. This wasn't the gentle, chaste courtship she had been taught to expect. This was something elemental, dangerous, and utterly thrilling. The storm hit 2 days later, dropping from the sky without warning. The heavens opened, turning the world into a churning chaos of wind and water. The cabin, which had felt like a fortress, now seemed fragile against the onslaught. Thunder cracked like a celestial whip, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Silas stood, his jaw tight. "Storm took the roof off this place once when I was a boy," he muttered, the memory etched on his face. "Gotta check the goats. I'm coming with you," Eliza said, grabbing a heavy oilskin coat before he could protest. His eyes met hers, and he saw the unshakable resolve there. He simply nodded. "Stay close." They fought their way to the barn through a maelstrom. The wind tore at them, and the mud sucked at their boots. Inside, the goats bleated in terror. While Silas worked to reinforce a groaning beam, Eliza moved among the animals, her voice low and steady, a calm anchor in the tempest. They worked in perfect, unspoken sync, a team forged in crisis. When the barn was secure, they stood for a moment in the relative quiet, drenched and breathing heavily. The storm raged outside, but inside their small sanctuary, a different kind of storm was brewing. Silas turned to her, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning. His hand, shaking slightly, came up to brush a strand of wet hair from her cheek. His touch was electric, sending a jolt straight to her core. "I've known strong women," he said, his voice a raw whisper above the wind. "But not like this. Not quiet strong, not steady. Strength isn't about being loud," she whispered back, her heart pounding. "It's about not running when the storm hits." His gaze dropped to her lips, and the air between them became thick, heavy with a longing that had been building since the moment he first saw her. The rules of the town, the propriety, the waiting, it all burned away in the face of this elemental truth. This was wilder than courtship, deeper than romance. It was recognition. He lowered his head, and his mouth found hers. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a collision. It was desperate and hungry, a release of all the unspoken tension, all the solitary pain. It tasted of rain and earth and a deep, soul-shaking loneliness that they both understood. Her arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, her body molding against his. She wasn't small in his arms. She was essential. They were two halves of a whole, two solitary storms that had finally found each other. And as the tempest raged outside, they created their own, a wild, passionate storm that promised to remake their world. Part 5. Forging a name in the wilderness. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and glittering in the morning sun. Inside the cabin, everything was different. The raw, passionate energy that had erupted between them in the barn now settled into a profound, intimate connection. They moved around each other with a new awareness, a shared language of lingering touches and smoldering glances. The loneliness that had defined both their lives had been broken, not just by companionship, but by a consuming wild love that felt as ancient and powerful as the mountains themselves. By summer, the ranch was transformed. It wasn't just the land that had changed. It was as if Eliza's own fiery spirit had been imprinted upon it. The sagging gate now stood straight, mended with her skilled hands. A vibrant garden bloomed with vegetables and herbs, defying the rocky soil, each bed lined with stones she had hauled from the creek herself. Her presence had brought not just order, but life. One morning, she woke to the sound of a hammer. Silas was outside by the main path leading to the cabin. He was driving a post into the ground, and affixed to it was a new sign, carved from a wide plank of pine. In letters burned deep into the wood, it read, "Blackwood and Vance." He hadn't asked. He hadn't made a grand speech. He had simply, in his solid, quiet way, declared them a partnership, a unit. He had placed her name beside his, giving it a place of honor, a place to stand. She stood in the doorway, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it felt like it might break her ribs. He turned and saw her, a shy, proud smile on his face. In that moment, he wasn't just a rancher. He was the keeper of her heart, the man who had not only seen her but had given her a name and a home in the wilderness. Their love was a wild thing, nurtured in the silence and forged in the storms. It was in the way he'd watch her hands, so small yet so capable, as she stitched leather or kneaded dough. It was in the way she'd bring him water in the fields, their hands brushing in a silent conversation that spoke volumes. Their nights were filled with a passion that was both tender and untamed, a rediscovery of a world they had both thought they were locked out of. In his arms, she was not just seen, she was worshipped. And in her presence, his deep, solitary quiet was filled with a light he never knew he was missing. That autumn, Eliza rode into town alone. Her basket was filled not with soap to sell, but with jars of spiced apple butter, a gift for Mrs. Albright and Mr. Abernathy. This wasn't about seeking approval. It was a statement. She was no longer the rejected mail-order bride. She was Eliza Vance of the Blackwood and Vance Ranch, a woman who had built a life with her own two hands. When she entered the general store, the room didn't just shift, it fell silent. Sterling, the merchant who had dismissed her, was at the counter. He turned, and his jaw dropped. She met his gaze, not with malice, but with the cool indifference of a woman who had found her own kingdom. She was wearing a simple dress of her own making. Her hair was tied back, and dust from the trail was on her cheeks. But she radiated a power and a confidence that made her seem 10 feet tall. She walked to the counter and placed the jars down for Mr. Abernathy. "A gift from our ranch," she said, her voice clear and steady. The entire store heard the word "our." Sterling's face flushed a dull, angry red. He had cast her aside like a pebble, and she had returned as part of a mountain. Without another glance at him, she turned and left. She hadn't needed to say a word to him. Her presence, her confidence, her partnership with Silas, It was the ultimate rebuttal. The ride back to the ranch was triumphant. The wind whipped at her hair, and she spurred her horse into a gallop, a wild cry of joy escaping her lips. She was free. Free from the judgment of small minds, free from the cage of her own past insecurities. She found Silas waiting on the porch, a look of quiet pride in his eyes. He had known she was going to town. He had trusted her to face her demons alone, and he was waiting to welcome his warrior home. He stood up as she dismounted and pulled her into his arms. "I saw him," she murmured into his chest. "I know," he rumbled, his hand stroking her hair. He pulled back, his intense gray eyes searching hers. "When I first saw you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "in that shop, it was like seeing a banked fire in a world of cold ash. I just wanted to get close to the warmth." He cupped her face in his rough hands. "Now, that fire is my sun, my moon, everything." He kissed her then. A deep, possessive kiss filled with the certainty of their shared future. They hadn't needed a preacher or a license. Their vows had been made in shared labor, in the heat of a storm, and in the quiet moments of understanding. They had forged their own union, as real and solid as the sign bearing both their names. They were a story the town would whisper for years, not of the girl who was too small, but of the woman whose love was big enough to tame the wilderness, and the quiet man who was wise enough to recognize its power. Part 6. A legacy carved in the Heartwood. Years flowed by like water in the creek, smoothing the sharp edges of the past. The Blackwood and Vance Ranch became a quiet landmark, a place known not for its size or wealth, but for its unshakable solidity. The story of Silas and Eliza became a local legend, a tale told by fireplaces on cold winter nights. They spoke of the quiet rancher who saw the fire in a woman everyone else had dismissed, and of the seamstress who built a life as strong and enduring as the mountains themselves. Their love didn't mellow with time. It deepened, its roots growing down into the very rock of the land. It was a fierce, protective love, a wild and tender passion that still sparked in their shared glances across the dinner table, and flared into life on cold nights by the fire. Eliza's spirit, once a contained flame, now burned bright and free. She moved with the confident grace of a woman who knew her own worth, a worth measured not by a yardstick, but by the love and respect of the man who stood beside her. She became a quiet pillar of the community she had once fled. When a sickness swept through a neighboring homestead, it was Eliza who rode out with broths and remedies. When a young bride, overwhelmed by the harshness of frontier life, felt her spirit breaking, she would find her way to the ranch. Eliza never offered platitudes or easy answers. She would simply sit with them, listen, and then, by her own example, show them that strength was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. She taught them that a woman's power was in her hands, in her heart, and in her refusal to be defined by anyone else. One crisp autumn morning, a girl appeared at the gate. She was no more than 16, with wide, terrified eyes, and the telltale dust of a long journey on her clothes. They said I was too plain," the girl whispered, tears tracing paths through the grime on her cheeks. "Said no man would have me, that I'm not good for anything but mending." Eliza's heart ached with a familiar pain. She saw herself in the girl's defeated posture, in the shame that clouded her eyes. She didn't ask who they were. The world was full of them. She simply opened the gate, her expression a mixture of fierce compassion and gentle understanding. "Mending is a fine skill," Eliza said, her voice calm and strong. "It's about making things whole again. There's no shame in that." She looked the girl squarely in the eye. "But you are more than what you can mend for others. Let's find out what you can build for yourself." The girl, whose name was Sarah, stayed for months. Under Eliza's patient tutelage, she learned not just to mend fences and tend a garden, but to mend her own fractured spirit. She watched as Eliza and Silas worked together, a partnership of equals. Their deep, abiding love, a silent, powerful lesson. She saw how Silas looked at his wife, with a reverence and a fiery passion that had not dimmed with the years. He never saw a small woman, he saw his magnificent, unbreakable Eliza. Silas, for his part, simply accepted the new presence as he accepted the changing seasons. He carved another chair for the table and treated Sarah with the same quiet respect he showed everyone. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch, watching the sky turn to bruised purple and gold, Silas slipped his hand into Eliza's. "I never knew what this place was missing," he said. His voice a low rumble meant only for her. "Until you came. You weren't just a missing piece, Eliza. You were the whole damn puzzle." She leaned her head on his shoulder, her heart full. "I thought I needed to change to be loved," she murmured. "But you just taught me how to be myself." When Eliza Vance Blackwood passed into the earth she had so lovingly tended, there was no grand funeral. But for weeks, a steady stream of people made the pilgrimage to the ranch. They were the women she had helped, the family she had supported, the children who had grown up on the legend of her strength. They didn't bring flowers. They brought stones from their own fields to add to her garden beds, and they told stories. Years later, travelers would stop at the ranch, now tended by a grown-up Sarah and her own family. They would see the sign, Blackwood and Vance, its letters faded but still proud. And they would always remark on the chair on the porch, the one Silas had carved for her, its wood worn smooth by time and love. A silent throne for a queen who had ruled not a kingdom of land, but of the heart. Her legacy wasn't written in books. It was carved in the heartwood of the people she touched. A testament to the quiet seamstress whose spirit was too vast and whose love was too wild to ever be measured. The story of Eliza and Silas teaches us a profound and timeless truth. The measure of a person is not found in the opinions of the crowd or the fleeting standards of society. True stature is found in the heart, in the unyielding resilience of the human spirit to rise above judgment and claim its own dignity. It is the courage to walk a lonely path toward an unknown future, and the wisdom to recognize a kindred soul in the wilderness. Theirs is a legacy of quiet strength and a love as wild and untamed as the frontier itself, a love that didn't just save them, but built a world. It reminds us that the most powerful force on earth is a person who, having been told they are not enough, decides to become everything. If this story of the untamed West resonated with your soul, please help our community grow. Subscribe to Wild West Stories, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded of their own inner strength. Your support allows us to keep these legends alive.